You may be seated. Our Torah reading for this Shabbat is taken from Parasha Chayei Sara. First of all, I want to wish a Yasher Koach to Jacob and Rochelle for leading parts of this morning's service. Is beautiful. Your mother and your father must be very proud. Oh, here they are. We wish them a mazel tov as well. Yasher Koach, beautiful. You know, it's strange in the world of publications, right? I pointed this out last year when we were reading this very same Parsha. We're reading about the death of Sarah, which the portion is called Chayei Sara, actually reminding us that as Jews, a very important lesson, obviously, is that we focus on life, we continue to focus on life and not on death. And in the very first pasuk, this pasuk that explains the burial of Sarah, and you're familiar with the story of the acquisition of Me'arat HaMachpelah, the cave of Machpelah, which becomes the first, if you will, Jewish holding in the Holy Land. So in that sense, it's very important. And it says in the second line there on your page, it says, when describing how old she is, she says, Mea shana ve'esrim shana ve'sheva shanim shenei chayei Sarah. That Sarah was 127 years old, and here it is on page 127. Go figure. That's the brilliance for today. So, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of highlights of this week's narrative in Bereshit. As you know, Bereshit is a story of a family following the story of a family, story of Avraham Avinu. And today, in many ways, recognizes the transition of a generation, very, very important concept in Judaism, and how is it that we continue to pass on our traditions and our faith belief to the next generation. And so Avraham has this same challenge. This Shabbat's portion talks not only about the passing of Sarah, but also at the end of the parsha, we read of the passing of Avraham. And so the mantle, if you will, falls to Yitzchak. Yitzchak, who will become the progenitor of the Jewish people. And what's important to note about Yitzchak, you know, Abraham wants to get his son married, and says, I don't want you to take a woman from amongst the Canaanite tribes amongst which we live, but I want you to go back to my homeland and, you know, find a nice Yiddish maidel for my boy. And so Eliezer is given this charge, and sure enough, he does it. And it's sort of an interesting question that Eliezer asks, because he's given this strange mission from Abraham. Abraham says, listen, you know, by the way, the boy is up in age now. Why exactly he needs a matchmaker, I don't know. It was before J-date, whatever the case may be. So Abraham sends Eliezer back to his birthplace so that they can find an appropriate woman. But Yitzhak, right, Eliezer asks about that. Why don't I take the boy with me? It sort of makes sense. I'm going to try to find a wife. Why don't I bring the boy with me so that he can meet the woman, right? To Rebecca's credit, she ends up accepting the conditions of a marriage, even though she's never met Yitzhak. The only thing that she knows, really, is that Avraham is a very important figure as a monotheist, as a proclaimer of the faith tradition. And so Rivka holds very, very high place in our eyes because of her faith in that process. But destiny has it that Yitzhak is the only one of our forefathers who never leaves the Holy Land, right? In many ways, this parsha is all about the eternal attachment of the Jewish people to the land and state of Israel, right? We have here the first recorded purchase of the land, right, which will continue. We have the notion that God creates that covenant with Abraham, that is a covenant of progeny, that is of descendants, and of course an attachment to the land. So we have this at the same time, this idea that Yitzhak is so bound to the land that he himself can't physically or spiritually give himself to leave Eretz Yisrael. So in that way, it's a very fascinating portion. What I do want to point out is that towards the end of the parsha, this is after his wife has passed away, it describes Abraham, and it says, "Vadonai beirach et Abraham bakol," and it says that Abraham was blessed with everything. So the commentators ask the question: if we're going to talk about the blessings of Abraham, why didn't we say it before his wife passed away? right? This is a strange time when he is that he's crying and weeping over. It's a strange time to say that he was blessed. I'd suggest the following, that our tradition says this. Our tradition says, and it's important as we look at these posters here today, our tradition says that even at time of loss, even at time of grieving, even at time of anguish, God continues to stand with us and God continues to bless us. And that was the blessing to Abraham, and certainly for the Jewish people and for our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael, to have that sense of being blessed by God, even in these horrendous and difficult times, is really very profound. So I want to just conclude my introduction by telling you quickly about an assembly that I ran this week. It was yesterday, actually, at our high school, our Jewish high school. And we decided that because we just completed a Shloshim observance, as many of you know, and there's been a custom in Israel, and it's taken place around the world also, to set up a Shabbat table for the hostages that are still missing. And so sure enough, I solicited the assistance of about 45, 50 kids who set up tables in our migrush, in our courtyard, in a U shape, just like everybody else is doing. And we had posters akin to these of each of the 239 hostages. And we made a point when we set the chairs up by the table that we would have the posters here facing one another, just as if they were to be sitting at the table. And it was a very, very profound visual. And to look at the scope of it and see all of these. And we had all of the kids from the high school come, and they stood around behind the entire setup of the tables as we read the names of each and every individual that is still kidnapped. And I will tell you, there were 500 people there. You could hear a pin drop. You could hear a pin drop. I kid you not. Same time, when we concluded our ceremony, and one of the nice things that we did in the ceremony was I mentioned to you that my daughter Danya had visited the kibbutzim in the south and visited the base where they're trying to identify bodies, etc. And so she wrote a note on her reflection, and I said to her, "You're writing for high school kids," and she wrote something very, very beautiful. And I will tell you that, this whole thing reminds me of Am Echad B'Lev Echad. I've said it a few times from our Bima. I said it when we had our Fort Lee rally last Sunday night. Am Echad B'Lev Echad, that we're one people with one heart. And it's the case. It's the truth that when one Jew is missing or one Jew is suffering, we all feel it. We all feel it. And I was astounded that when we ran this ceremony, how connected these kids are. Right? They're regular kids, a couple years older than you, but regular Jewish kids. These kids, you could hear a pin drop. They were crying. The rest of the afternoon, kids were circling about the courtyard, going up to each chair, reading the biography of the various Hatufim, the people who are still kidnapped. It was so moving. And I think it's important that from this week's Parsha, that we remember Vadonai Beirachat Abraham Bakol, that even though we're going through trying and difficult times, obviously as a people and as a community, Vadonai Beirachat Abraham Bakol, we continue to be blessed by God, by His presence, His guidance, and God willing, His salvation, B'imhera v'yameinu, speedily and in our day. And let us together say Amen. We invite you to follow along with the Torah reading. Our Torah reading begins on page 127.